Okay, so you want to own a medieval brewery. In your head, it's simple: a big steaming kettle, a few oak barrels, farmers laughing over foaming mugs, coins rolling in every day because everybody drinks. And that part's true. Beer was safer than the water, and everyone from the priest to the plowman drank it daily. Here's the twist: for the first 300 years of this business, the person actually brewing it, pricing it, and selling it out of the front door was almost never a man. It was your wife. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually costs to get into brewing at three different levels, from one cauldron in a kitchen to an entire abbey's estate. You'll know exactly where every penny of ale money came from, and why a product nobody could stop buying still bankrupted people constantly. You'll find out who really controlled this business behind the scenes, and finally that a medieval brewery was never actually a beverage business at all. It was something else wearing a beverage business's clothes. Somewhere in the middle, there's a real law that could make you personally, physically liable for a total stranger's bad hangover. Hang on to that one. There were three real ways into this trade, and the gap between them is the whole story. At the bottom, entry cost you almost nothing because you already owned the tools. If you ran a household in medieval England, you already had a cauldron for cooking and tubs for washing, and that was more or less a brewery. Historians who study this period point out that the women who dominated small-scale brewing weren't investing in a new trade. They already possessed the exact skills and equipment the job required because brewing looked almost identical to cooking dinner. What you got for that near-zero investment was the right to brew a batch every week or two and sell it straight out of your own door with a broom or a green bush hung outside as your only advertising, telling the village a fresh batch was ready. This was the level Cecilia Pennefader lived at, a real, documented single woman from the village of Brigstock, born around 1297, who appears again and again in the manor court roles historians still study today, right up until her death in 1344, 3 years before the Black Death reached England. One level up in a city like London, entry meant joining an organized trade. Brewers there had been meeting informally since at least 1292, but in 1406 they successfully petitioned the mayor and aldermen for the right to appoint their own masters and wardens, and in 1437 King Henry VI granted them a royal charter. Getting in here cost you years of apprenticeship, a sponsor already inside the trade, and an entrance fee, a real barrier, not a suggestion. What you bought with all of that was the right to use the guild's seal of quality and sell into a bigger, richer, thirstier urban market. At the very top sat the monasteries, and here the entry cost wasn't measured in shillings at all. It was an entire estate. The Abbey of Weihenstephan in Bavaria received its official license to brew and sell beer from the city of Freising in the year 1040, under Abbot Arnold, and that brewery is still running today, nearly 1,000 years later, generally recognized as the oldest continuously operating brewery on Earth. The Abbey of St. Gallen in what's now Switzerland had architectural plans from around the year 820 showing not one brewhouse but three, built directly into the monastery walls. What that scale of investment bought you was almost unfair. Monks worked for free under religious obedience, the grain came off land the abbey already owned, and the whole operation paid no tax to anyone. Here's a pattern worth keeping in mind as we go. The people who lasted longest in this trade weren't necessarily the best brewers. They built something that could keep going without them, and by the end of this video, that's exactly the gap you'll see between a household that broke even for 3 generations and one small medieval brewhouse still making money for people born centuries after its founder died. Now, 3 things nobody warns you about before you sign up for any of this. First, ale spoils in days, so you can never build up stock the way a grain merchant can. You are always, permanently, in production. Second, in large parts of medieval Europe, you didn't get to choose your own bittering ingredient. A local lord or bishop held a monopoly on a mandatory herb blend called gruit, and you had to buy it from his gruit house whether you wanted to or not, which functioned as a hidden tax baked directly into your ingredients. And third, there was a real inspector, the ale conner sworn in every year at the local court, whose entire job was tasting your batch and fining you if it fell short. And here's the fact that tends to get repeated at dinner parties. In the royal household of Henry VIII, a maid of honor was formally allowed 8 gallons of ale a day, and a further gallon on top of that if she was still thirsty. The beer in question was roughly 1 to 1.5% alcohol, so nobody was staggering around Hampton Court. But it tells you something real about how this product was budgeted for, not as a treat, but as a utility, like firewood or candles. So, where does the money in a business like this actually come from? Picture a single Monday. You're up before sunrise because yesterday's batch is already turning, and ale doesn't wait for anyone. You mash the grain, you fire the copper, and by midday you're selling straight out of your own door at whatever price the assize of bread and ale says you're allowed to charge that week. A national pricing rule that had been in place in England since at least 1266, moving automatically with the price of grain. A penny buying roughly 2 gallons of ale in a city, or 3 to 4 gallons out in the country. The ale conner might stop by before you've even finished serving. A regular buys on credit again, promising to settle up at harvest, and tomorrow you'll do the entire thing over again because the batch you just sold is already the only stock you have left. That's the real shape of this business. Less like selling a product, more like running the only water utility in town, except this water utility also delivers calories and a very mild buzz. And the bill comes due every single day because the product spoils if you don't sell it. Now watch the small number turn into a large one. A single household of 5 people might need around 1.25 gallons of ale a day just to function, according to historians who've worked through parish records. Multiply that by a village the size of Brigstock, with roughly 1,000 people in it, and you're already talking about hundreds of gallons moving every single day, at a fixed, tiny price per gallon, forever, because nobody in medieval England was switching to water. Turn that number over once, though, because the popular version of this story doesn't survive the math. You'll often hear that medieval people drank a full gallon of ale a day, every day, which would work out to something like 365 gallons a year per person. Historians who've actually run the grain math on this, how much malt medieval England produced versus how many people needed to drink from it, land much closer to 60 to 95 gallons a year per adult. That's still enormous by modern standards, several times what an American drinks in beer today, but it's a fraction of the folklore number, and it matters because the real economics of this business were built on constant, moderate, daily demand, not on a nation of medieval alcoholics. Break that demand into where it actually landed, and you get 3 to 4 separate income streams. The biggest slice was ordinary daily ale sold at the fixed assize price. Huge volume, razor-thin margin, the absolute bread and butter of the trade. A second stream was stronger ale sold to travelers, inns, and the households of the wealthy, priced above the standard assize because it was a different, richer product. A third stream, and this one surprises people, was the parish church ale, an organized village-wide brewing event where the whole parish brewed and sold ale specifically to raise money for the church roof or the poor box. And in many rural English parishes, this was one of the single biggest sources of community income all year. And a fourth, smaller stream was simply the leftover spent grain, sold on afterward as animal feed. So almost nothing in the brewing process went to waste. Put it all together, and the formula for this business is almost insultingly simple. Ale income equals price per gallon times gallons sold times the number of days a year you're still standing to sell it. Spoilage, a fine or a bad harvest, could end that third factor at any time. And because the price was fixed by the crown and the volume was capped by your own 2 arms and 1 cauldron, almost everything else in this entire industry for the next 300 years existed purely to fight over that one factor. How many days a batch of your product could survive? You've almost certainly walked past the ghost of this system without noticing it. Picture any old English pub sign swinging outside a building on a quiet street. That image is a direct descendant of the medieval ale stake, a pole or a green bush hung outside a house the moment a fresh batch was ready to drink. It wasn't decoration, it was a live inventory signal to the entire street. This house has beer today, and only today because tomorrow it might already be sour. Behind that simple sign sat several layers of design you were never meant to notice. The first is the ale conner, or gustator servicii in the Latin of the court rolls. An officer sworn in annually to walk from house to house tasting batches, checking they matched the legal standard, called the assize, and fining anyone who came up short. This wasn't a courtesy inspection. It was a recurring cost of doing business, built permanently into your margins. The second layer is the one that made this whole trade dangerous to challenge without anyone quite noticing. Gruit, or Gruitrecht. In large stretches of the Holy Roman Empire, a local bishop or lord owned the exclusive legal right to the herb mixture used to bitter and preserve beer before hops arrived, and you were required to buy it from his brewhouse, at his price, regardless of whether it actually suited your recipe. Which is where this gets genuinely strange. In 1381, the Archbishop of Cologne went so far as to decree that all brewers in his territory must buy Grut from the official Episcopal Brewhouse and formally banned the importing of hopped beer from outside. Not for taste reasons, but because hopped beer threatened to make an entire tax base obsolete overnight. The third layer is credit, and it's the part that reveals how sophisticated this simple household trade actually was. Because ale was bought daily but wages were paid weekly, seasonally, or after harvest, alewives routinely extended informal credit to their regular customers. Surviving account books show individual brewsters tracking debts owed by well over 100 separate customers at once, some of it outstanding for months. An entire private banking system running quietly underneath a business that looked, from the street, like nothing more than a woman with a pot. And there was a VIP tier here too. In university towns like Oxford, the colleges and their scholars represented a wealthy, demanding customer base that ale houses depended on and were, in turn, regulated because of. It got specific enough that a law under King Edward III made a married brewster's husband personally liable if a scholar was harmed by a batch of substandard ale sold under her name, which tells you exactly how much economic weight that one customer segment carried in that particular market. You're probably starting to see it already. Every layer in this section, the ale conner, the Grut monopoly, the license itself, has less to do with beer and more to do with who's legally allowed to sell it, and on what terms. The beer is almost beside the point. So if demand for this product was this reliable, why did people running this business keep going under? Because reliable demand was never the problem. Everything else was. Start at the top of the cost pile and work down. Grain came first, and grain prices could move violently. Cecilia Pennefader herself lived directly through the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, years when harvests across northern Europe failed, grain prices doubled and tripled while whole villages went hungry, and every sack of malt that went into a batch of ale was a sack of grain that wasn't going into someone's bread. On top of that sat guild politics. After 1406, and especially after the 1437 Royal Charter, London's trade increasingly ran through masters, wardens, and entrance fees, and staying inside that system cost money every single year, whether you brewed a single batch or 1,000. Add to that the Grut levy, a cost you paid whether or not you wanted the ingredient, simply because the local lord owned the monopoly on it. Underneath all of it sat fuel, heating a full copper of wort day after day, because your product physically could not be stockpiled. Burning through firewood at a rate a baker or a weaver never had to match. And running through the whole pile were the ale conner's fines, a routine cost of doing business that functioned less like punishment and more like a subscription fee for staying open. Now that early warning finally lands personally on you. Remember the law under Edward III. The one where a husband was legally responsible for harm caused by his wife's substandard ale to an Oxford scholar? That threat wasn't abstract. If your household brewed and something went wrong, the law didn't reach for the woman standing at the mash tub. It reached for you, the husband, your body, your property, your name on the court roll, for a batch you may never have personally touched. If this trade had a motto, it would be this: your revenue was fixed by law, your price was fixed by law, your volume was capped by law, and not one other thing about running this business was guaranteed at all. 2 mistakes killed brewing operations in this world, over and over, for 3 centuries. The first is not adapting to who's allowed to own the business at all. Through the 1300s, brewing was overwhelmingly run by women, whether married, single, or widowed. But as the trade became more profitable, it also became more organized. And organization became the tool used to push them out. When London's brewers formalized into a guild with a master, a warden, sponsorship requirements, and entrance fees between 1406 and 1438, women found themselves excluded almost by design. Unable to sponsor themselves in, unable to complete an apprenticeship that assumed you weren't the one raising the children. In university towns like Oxford, a widow could keep running her late husband's brewhouse only as long as she didn't remarry and no male heir stepped forward to claim it. A narrow window that closed a little further every year. By around 1500, according to historians who've traced this collapse in detail, the transformation was essentially complete. An industry that had been substantially run by women for 300 years had been legislated, guild-charted, and technologically priced out of their hands. The rule this teaches you: in a trade with zero barriers to entry, the fastest way to win isn't a better product. It's writing a rule that changes who's legally allowed to compete at all. The second mistake was clinging to an old monopoly instead of adapting to a better technology, and the clearest version of this played out around the Dutch city of Zwolle. The Bishop of Utrecht held the Groot monopoly across the region and, in 1404, leased the right to collect that Groot tax to the city itself for a fee of £100 a year. But hopped beer imported from further north was already spreading fast because it didn't require Groot at all, and it kept for months instead of days. Within years, the city was complaining directly to the bishop that the income from Gruit sales no longer covered even the £100 lease they owed him. The tax base had simply evaporated underneath them while they were still busy protecting it. It's the exact same mistake as refusing to sell anything except fresh milk delivered door to door while your competitor down the street starts selling something shelf-stable that lasts a year in a warehouse. You can defend your old monopoly as hard as you like, but eventually your customers just stop needing it. If your schedule allows one more minute here, there's a full obituary worth telling. The Břevnov Monastery Brewery, founded in the Czech lands in the year 993, making it one of the oldest breweries ever recorded anywhere. It survived nearly 1,000 years of small events rather than one giant catastrophe. Smashed during the Hussite Wars in the early 1400s, rebuilt from nothing in 1720, eventually brewing 5,000 hectoliters a year at its peak. And then it didn't end in a fire or a war at all. It ended in 1889, without any drama at all, because its cellar simply wasn't big enough anymore for the beer refrigeration methods everyone else had already moved to. And when a nearby street was widened in 1953, the empty building itself was simply torn down. Nearly a millennium of survival, undone in the end by a basement that was the wrong size. That's the real lesson buried in almost every collapse in this industry. It's never one bankruptcy filing. It's 100 years of small, boring, unglamorous line items, and then one day the building just isn't there anymore. There is one group in this story that won, systematically, for 1,000 years running, and it's worth naming exactly why. The monasteries. Weihenstephan is still brewing today, in the year 2026, on the same hill it started on in 1040. Dozens of other abbey breweries across Europe, including all 11 of the remaining Trappist breweries, are still doing the same thing their founders were doing 8 or 9 centuries ago. That's not luck. That's a repeatable playbook, and it runs in roughly 6 steps. 1. Secure the legal license before you build anything, the way that same abbot did back in 1040, rather than operating in a legal gray zone the way most household brewers had to. 2. Eliminate your 2 biggest costs entirely. Benedictine monasteries used monks' labor under religious obedience instead of paid wages, and grain grown on land the abbey already owned instead of grain bought at market price. 3. Secure a formal tax exemption from the ruling authority, rather than hoping nobody notices you. 4. Build permanent stone infrastructure, a real brewhouse, a real cellar, A real cooperative, the way St. Gallen's plan shows three separate brewing buildings inside the monastery walls, instead of a rented room with a borrowed cauldron. 5. Sell upward as well as locally to travelers, nobility, and guest houses rather than depending on one village's daily thirst. And 6, maybe the most important, put the license in the name of an institution that cannot die, instead of a person who inevitably will. Plague, fire, and famine kept killing individual monks and individual brewers throughout this story. But the abbey itself simply kept going, generation after generation, because an institution doesn't catch the plague. Which gets at the real difference underneath this whole video. One brewer, however skilled, is a job. An institution built to outlive every single person who ever works inside it is a business. Okay, so let's take a step back, because now the contradiction from the start of this video actually has an answer. How can a product that literally nobody could stop buying, safer than water, drunk at every meal by every social class, also be a product that bankrupted people constantly? Compare it to something like importing spice or wine in this same period. Rarer, more volatile demand, but real pricing power and real profit margins for whoever controlled the supply. Brewing had the opposite problem entirely. The demand was as close to guaranteed as anything in the medieval economy. But the price was fixed by the crown, the recipe's key ingredient was frequently taxed by a monopoly you didn't control, and the barrier to entry was so low that literally any household with a cauldron was your competitor by Tuesday afternoon. Guaranteed demand plus a fixed price, plus zero barrier to entry, doesn't produce guaranteed profit. It produces exactly what medieval brewing actually was: thousands of people fighting over the same fixed penny, forever, with survival decided entirely by whoever controlled their costs best. That's the real trade at the heart of this entire industry. Guaranteed thirst against completely unguaranteed grain prices, guild politics, tax monopolies, and your own body's legal liability under the law. And as you're about to see, the rewards for actually surviving that trade were not small. Here's the question you actually came here for. If you'd done everything right, how much would you have walked away with? Take the modest path first. You're a single household brewer, like Cecilia Pennefader's neighbors in Brigstock. Total investment close to nothing because you already own the cauldron and the tubs. You brew what your household can manage, sell the surplus at the fixed assize price of roughly 2 to 4 gallons a penny, and extend a little quiet credit to regulars the way alewives across England did for generations. There's no path here to real wealth. The price is fixed by the crown and the volume is capped by your own two arms. But the payback period is close to instant, because your only investment was equipment you already owned. It's boring. It's also one of the most durable small businesses in the entire medieval economy, because everyone, every single day, needs to drink something. Now take it all the way to the top. You're not a household brewer anymore. You're something closer to Hans Welser, a real brewer recorded in the Munich tax rolls of 1397 running a small operation called the Welser Brew. That brewery changed hands several times over the next 400 years, picking up the name it still carries somewhere along the way, until in 1807 it was purchased by Gabriel Sedlmayr while it was, by his own account, the smallest brewery in Munich. Watch what happens next. Sedlmayr's family turned it into the largest brewery in the entire city by 1867, and today that same brewery, Spaten, sits inside Anheuser-Busch InBev, the single largest beer company on the planet. Hans Welser never got rich off this. He was long dead before the fortune ever arrived. The real lesson of the top scenario isn't the payout to the founder at all, it's that the institution he started outlived him by over 600 years and counting, and the wealth eventually landed on people who weren't even born yet when he set up his kettle. Your aspirational figure, then, isn't a person at all. It's a brewhouse on a single street in Munich, first written down in a tax record in 1397, that is, right now, in 2026, still legally connected to the largest brewing company that has ever existed on Earth. That's the lightning strike number to actually take away from this video. A 629-year unbroken chain from one small kettle to a global empire, and not one single person who owned it along the way got to keep the whole thing. You thought you were buying a brewery? What you were actually buying every single day was permission to survive one more week. Permission the crown, a bishop, or a guild could grant, tax, or take away, and never once sold to you outright. Which brings us back to where we started. Okay, so you wanted to own a medieval brewery. Turns out for the first 300 years of this story, you probably already did. You just needed to have been born a woman to hold the ladle, and even then, sooner or later, somebody was always going to find a way to write your name off the deed.